The siege was over. The cannons had fallen silent. The British had surrendered. Inside the shattered walls of Fort William Henry, men who had spent days under fire finally believed the nightmare was ending. They had terms. They had an escort. They had been promised safe passage south. A few hours later, in the woods beyond the fort, that promise would come apart in front of them. What happened on that forest road would become one of the most infamous episodes in early American history. Not because people died in war. People died in war constantly on this frontier. But because this was supposed to be the moment the killing stopped. So how does a formal surrender, signed by professional officers and sealed with the honors of war, dissolve into chaos, plunder, and a memory so raw that generations would remember it by a single word, massacre? The answer does not begin at the fort. It begins on a much larger map. In the mid-18th century, Britain and France were locked in a rivalry that no longer fit on a single continent. Their quarrels spilled across oceans, into fishing grounds, fur country, and the rivers that carried goods deep into the interior of North America. Two empires were learning that the next great war between them would not be decided in Europe alone. It would be decided in places most Europeans could not even pronounce. One of those places was a long, narrow lake hidden in the forests of upstate New York. The British called it Lake George, after their king. The French called it Lac du Saint-Sacrement. Beautiful names for what was, in military terms, a knife laid across the wilderness. It pointed straight at the heart of New France in one direction, and straight at the British colonies in the other. Whoever held that lake held the road between New York and Montreal. That is why both sides built forts at its ends. To the north, the French raised Fort Carillon. To the south, the British built Fort William Henry. Two fortifications staring at each other across 45 miles of cold water, each one daring the other to make the first move. Fort William Henry was not a grand stone citadel. It was a frontier stronghold of earth and logs, walls 30 feet thick in places, ringed by a dry moat and backed by an entrenched camp on the rise to the east. Solid, practical, built to hold a few hundred men against the kind of enemy this wilderness usually produced, raiders, scouts, and small war parties. It was not built to survive a full European siege train. That detail would matter more than anyone inside the walls yet understood. By the summer of 1757, 3 men carried the weight of what was coming. The first war French blew. Louis-Joseph de Montcalm had crossed the Atlantic to command the king's forces in Canada, and he brought with him the certainties of European warfare, siege lines, batteries, formal etiquette, the orderly geometry of trenches creeping toward a doomed wall. He had little patience for the chaos of the woods. He intended to reduce Fort William Henry the way he would have reduced a fortress in Flanders. What he did not yet realize was that this campaign would test, and ultimately break, that certainty. The second man was different in almost every way. Lieutenant Colonel George Monro was a career Scotsman in a red coat, the kind of officer armies are built on rather than written about. Steady, professional, stubborn when stubbornness was the only weapon left. His orders were the simplest and cruelest a soldier can receive. Hold the fort until help comes. Help, if it came, would have to come from the third man. And that is where the story begins to tilt. General Daniel Webb sat at Fort Edward, only 16 miles to the south. On paper, he was Monro's lifeline. In practice, he was a commander paralyzed by everything that might go wrong. He pictured French armies larger than they were. He pictured his own army smaller than it was. He pictured Albany falling behind him if he moved a single regiment forward. 16 miles is not far. For Webb, in the summer of 1757, it would prove impossibly far. The trap was already closing before the first cannon was wheeled into place. That spring, the French had tested Fort William Henry with a smaller force and withdrawn, but they had quietly destroyed the British bateau at the lake's edge, robbing the garrison of mobility before the real campaign even began. By July, Montcalm was assembling something far more dangerous. Thousands of regulars, Canadian militia, and engineers, supported by a heavy siege train of artillery and mortars hauled south by water. And alongside them came nearly 2,000 Allied warriors drawn from many indigenous nations across the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence. To French officers, they were not auxiliaries. They were the difference between fighting in North America and surviving in it. Montcalm himself admitted that in the woods of the New World, Allied warriors were as necessary as cavalry on the plains of Europe. Inside the fort, the men understood none of this in detail. They only knew the lake had gone quiet in a way that lakes do not go quiet on their own. They knew supplies were being counted twice. They knew Monro had written to Webb, and that the letters had stopped coming back the way they wanted. And they knew one question they could not answer aloud. Was anyone coming for them at all? On the morning of August 3, that question received a partial answer. The defenders climbed to the ramparts and saw the lake transformed. A French flotilla of nearly 400 boats moved south in disciplined columns. Bateaux lashed together in pairs to carry cannon low across the water, canoes slicing ahead of them with allied warriors in war paint. The fort had not been approached. It had been arrived at in force in full daylight, with no attempt at concealment. This was not a raid. This was a verdict. Montcalm sent in a polite, deadly note demanding surrender. He even reminded Monro, with chilling courtesy, that once the fighting began he might not be able to restrain the indigenous warriors fighting alongside him. Monro refused. He promised to resist to the last extremity, and sent runners crashing south through the forest toward Fort Edward. Then he waited. So did everyone behind the walls with him. What followed was not a battle. It was a slow, methodical strangling. While the defenders manned their guns, the French were not charging. They were digging. Trees fell. Earth moved. Lines of trench snaked through the woods, each one closer than the last, each one shielding the next gun emplacement. From the ramparts, the British could watch their own death sentence being constructed in real time, one shovelful at a time. By the time the first French batteries opened fire, the geometry of the siege had already decided the outcome. The garrison just did not know it yet. The opening bombardment rearranged everything inside the fort. Smoke hung over the parade ground. Splinters tore through the air every time a shell struck the log facing. Surgeons worked in cramped rooms with too many wounded and too little light. Wives and children of soldiers. The camp followers no military report ever bothered to count properly, crouched wherever the walls were thickest. Above them, gunners answered the French as long as their pieces held together. Several did not. Overheated barrels split. Carriages shattered. Each British gun lost was a voice silenced in a conversation the fort could not afford to lose. Each new dawn the French were closer. That was the rhythm now. Not days marked on a calendar, but distances marked in yards. 200 yards. 150. The trenches advanced like a tide that only ever came in. Eventually the French guns were firing at point-blank range for siege artillery, and the breaches in the walls began to widen faster than men could repair them. Inside, exhaustion turned into something heavier than exhaustion. The defenders had begun the siege with the belief that endurance was a strategy. They had told themselves Webb would come. They had told themselves the wilderness would slow the French. They had told themselves the walls were thicker than the cannon. By midweek, all three illusions were failing at the same time. And then came the cruelest moment of the entire siege. It did not arrive in the form of a cannonball. It arrived as a piece of paper. Montcalm had intercepted a message from Webb to Monro, a message in which the general at Fort Edward 16 miles away made it plain that reinforcements would not be coming, and that Monro should seek the best terms he could. Montcalm, in a stroke of psychological warfare worthy of any modern commander, sent the captured letter into the fort under flag of truce. Imagine being Monro, reading that. Imagine being the soldier standing at his shoulder, watching his face. The fort had been bombarded for days. Now it had been abandoned in writing. After that, the end was a matter of arithmetic. The walls were giving way. Guns were dead. Ammunition was running thin. The relief column existed only in the imagination of men too proud to say so aloud. After 7 days from the first French boats and 6 punishing days of full siege, Monro asked for terms. And what Montcalm offered him sounded almost like deliverance. By the standards of 18th century European war, the terms were generous, even gracious. The garrison would march out with the honors of war. They could keep their muskets, though not their ammunition. They would carry one symbolic cannon. Their wounded would be cared for by the French. They would be escorted south to Fort Edward. In return, they would simply agree not to take up arms against France for 18 months. Inside the broken fort, the relief must have been physical. Men who had been counting heartbeats between cannonballs were suddenly counting hours until they would be safe behind friendly walls. They had lost the fort, but they had kept their lives, their honor, their flag, and the long road home. That belief, that quiet, exhausted, almost tearful belief, was the most dangerous thing inside Fort William Henry that night, because the greatest danger had not passed. It had only changed shape. To understand what happened next, you have to step back from the surrender table and look at the army that had just won the battle. Montcalm's victory had been built on more than French regulars. Walking the forest paths and crowding the lake shore were warriors from many different indigenous nations, Abenaki, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Menominee, and others, some from as far as the upper Great Lakes. They had not traveled hundreds of miles to watch a European ceremony. They had traveled to fight, and in their own martial traditions, victory carried obligations the French parchment had quietly erased. For many of these warriors, war was not separable from its rewards. Captives, plunder, weapons, and trophies were not crimes against an enemy. They were the recognized fruits of a successful campaign, proof of courage, status earned in the eyes of relatives at home, the very reason for joining a distant expedition in the first place. French recruiters had openly promised such rewards to bring them south. Then Montcalm signed his European agreement, and in a single afternoon those rewards vanished. He tried to make it right. He summoned the chiefs. He explained the terms through interpreters in many languages across many cultures. He asked for their consent, but communication was not the same thing as consent, and consent was not the same thing as control. That night, the first cracks appeared. Warriors entered the fort and found what the surrender had left behind: stores, equipment, and the British wounded who could not march. Some of those wounded were killed where they lay. Officers shouted, order frayed. Outside the walls, the air had the brittle quality that comes before something breaks. By morning, the column was forming. Soldiers, officers, women, children, servants, enslaved Africans whose names few records preserved. A long, thin, weaponless line of human beings carrying everything they owned, stretching out along the forest road toward Fort Edward. And on either side of that road, the woods were not empty. The attack did not begin as a battle. It began as a current. Warriors moved into the column from its edges, pulling at packs, tearing away clothing, claiming the spoils the surrender had denied them. Voices rose, hands were raised. Then a shot, then another. Then the line was no longer a line. What followed was not a planned massacre in the European sense of the word. It was the collapse of every barrier between two ways of making war. Men were dragged out of the column. Some were killed in moments of fear and fury. Others were seized as captives and led north toward Canada, where they could be ransomed back, adopted into families, or kept for years. Some British soldiers and civilians broke and ran into the trees, and a few of them were lucky enough to find Fort Edward days later, half naked, half starved, and unable to describe what they had seen. Montcalm and his officers rushed into the chaos and did what they could. By their own accounts, supported in part by later historians, they argued, intervened, and ransomed back hundreds of prisoners in the days that followed. Around 400 captives were eventually recovered. But for the people on that road, the rescue came too late. Or not at all. For a long time afterward, no one could agree on how many had died. In the immediate aftermath, the numbers grew with the telling. Some early accounts spoke of 1,000 victims. A few claimed 1,500. These figures spread through colonial newspapers and pamphlets, where each retelling pressed harder on outrage than on arithmetic. Modern historians, working back through period documents, muster rolls, and prisoner records, paint a far more measured, and still terrible, picture. The likely death toll on the road and inside the fort sits somewhere under 200, with figures around 185% frequently cited, and a wide range of estimates depending on which categories of victims are counted. Many more were taken captive. Many others vanished into the woods and into history. The numbers shrank with time. The wound did not. Because what made Fort William Henry unforgettable was never really the count. It was the betrayal embedded in the experience, the certainty of safety, broken in front of the people who had been promised it. For Montcalm, the aftertaste was bitter even in victory. His indigenous allies, dissatisfied and burdened with captives, began to leave for home. His Canadian militia were needed for the harvest. The army that had walked through the gates of Fort William Henry was no longer the army that could march on Fort Edward. He burned the fort to its foundations and turned north, his triumph already half spoiled in his own hands. In British North America, the news of what had happened on that forest road did something a routine defeat could never have done. It changed the war. Webb's failure to march became a public scandal almost overnight. The Indian agent William Johnson, who had arrived at Fort Edward with men ready to move, reportedly called Webb a coward in private, and many colonists soon said worse in public. Every account of the surrender carried with it the same furious undertone, that the British Army had not only lost a fort, but lost faith with the people it was meant to protect. Recruitment hardened. Resentment hardened. The memory of the road from Fort William Henry walked beside every British column for years to come. When the British struck back at Carillon the following year, and again in the campaigns that finally crushed New France, The dead of Fort William Henry walked invisibly in their ranks. For nearly 2 centuries, the fort itself lay forgotten in the soil at the south end of Lake George. But the story refused to be buried. It found a new life in the pages of a novel. James Fenimore Cooper published The Last of the Mohicans, and in doing so he reached past the historians and straight into the imagination of the world. He invented Hawkeye and Uncas and Chingachgook. Invented Cora and Alice, the fictional daughters of Colonel Monro. He bent the history, simplified the cultures, and amplified the violence, and in the process he gave the massacre a permanence that pure history rarely achieves. Generations grew up knowing Fort William Henry not from documents but from chapters, and later from films. The novel kept the memory alive. It also reshaped it, sometimes beyond recognition. In the 20th century, archaeologists finally came to the ground itself, where Cooper had given the story a soul of imagination. The diggers gave it something quieter, and in its own way more moving, the small human evidence of people who had actually lived inside those walls. A button, a musket ball stopped by bone, a medicine cup, a child's gaming piece. The remains of meals interrupted. These are not the relics of legend. They are the remains of a Tuesday afternoon, ended too soon. Stand on the reconstructed walls today, looking north up Lake George, and the lake is silent. The woods are calm. The water still points like a blade between 2 countries that no longer exist. It is hard to picture 400 boats moving across that surface. It is harder still to picture the road, somewhere just beyond the parking lots and souvenir shops, where the column came apart. That, perhaps, is the final lesson of Fort William Henry. Everyone on that road, the British soldier clinging to a signed promise, the French officer trusting the etiquette of his profession, the warrior demanding the recognition his culture had earned, the general miles away choosing caution over courage, believed they were acting inside the rules. The tragedy was that the rules were not the same rules. The siege lasted 7 days. The walls were rebuilt. The novels were written. The lake went back to being beautiful. But somewhere in the long memory of the continent, a column is still forming on a forest road, still believing it is safe, still about to learn that a surrender on paper is only as strong as the smallest misunderstanding standing in the trees. And that is the part of Fort William Henry that no treaty, no truce, and no passage of years has ever quite been able to bury.